Hey, learner, welcome back for another deep dive. We're diving into global elections today and all the craziness happening this year.
It's really been a roller coaster ride for democracy.
Seriously. I mean, think about it. It's only October, and we've already seen, what, like dozens of elections worldwide?
It's unprecedented, really, and the trends we're seeing, they're not what anyone expected.
Right. We keep hearing about democracy being in decline, but then you look at the actual data and
The data tells a very different story.
exactly. Like take voter turnout, for example.
Yeah.
Isn't that supposed to be like the big indicator of how healthy democracy is? People are disillusioned, staying home on election day?
Yeah, that's the narrative we're used to. But, and this is the surprising part, global voter turnout is actually up this year. Significantly.
For real. That's kind of amazing. I would have thought with all the talk about polarization and echo chambers and,
Yeah.
well, everything else, people would just be tuning out.
It seems like the opposite is happening. People are actually more engaged than they have been in decades.
So what's going on? Why are people suddenly so fired up to vote?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no single answer. But The Economist had a great piece on this. Half the world has had elections so far this year, and it highlighted some fascinating trends.
Oh, yeah, that's the article we're using for today's deep dive.
Right, and one of the things they pointed out was that higher voter turnout isn't just happening in, those rock-solid democracies we always hear about.
You mean like the Scandinavias and Canadas of the world?
Exactly. We're seeing it across the board, even in countries with what experts call flawed democracies.
Flawed democracies. That sounds diplomatic.
Well, it basically means countries that hold elections, but where there might be issues with corruption, limits on free speech, or other challenges.
Gotcha. So even in those places, people are showing up to vote in bigger numbers.
It seems so. Take France, for instance. They had that really tight presidential race earlier this year, remember?
How could I forget? The whole world was watching.
And turnout was way higher than anyone expected. Same thing in Indonesia. It's the world's third largest democracy, and they just had a record number of people voting.
Wow, those are some pretty big examples. Any other surprises in the turnout department?
Well, what about those European Parliament elections? Those don't exactly scream must-watch TV.
You're telling me. They're usually about as exciting as watching paint dry.
Right. But even there, turnout was significantly higher than in previous years, so it does make you wonder, what's driving this renewed interest?
It's like democracy is having a moment, right? But why now? What's changed?
That's the question we'll try to unpack. Is it a response to global events, a sense of urgency about certain issues, or something else entirely? It's a question worth exploring.
It really is. And it's not just about showing up to vote either. Remember all that talk about election manipulation a few years back, especially with social media and all that?
Oh, absolutely. Disinformation, foreign interference, it felt like the whole system was under attack.
It did. Well, guess what? It seems those tactics might be less effective than we initially feared.
There have been some pretty amazing examples of resilience.
Like what? Give me some good news.
Taiwan's election comes to mind. China made some pretty blatant attempts to interfere, spreading misinformation, trying to sway public opinion. It was really in-your-face stuff.
But it didn't work.
Ultimately, it backfired. Voters saw through it and made their choices based on what mattered most to them.
That's incredible. It's like democracy developed some antibodies or something.
It's a good analogy. And speaking of standing up for democracy, Senegal had a pretty inspiring moment this year, too.
Oh, yeah. What happened there again?
Their top court, backed by massive public protests, actually blocked a power grab by the ruling party.
Whoa. That's some serious judicial independence right there.
It was. They were trying to change election laws in their favor, but the court basically said, nope, not on our watch.
Good for them. That took guts.
It did. And it was a real victory for democracy and citizen engagement, people power in action.
Okay, so we've got people voting in droves, resisting manipulation, and even pushing back against power grabs.
Yeah.
Is it safe to say that things are looking up for democracy?
Well, before we break out the champagne, there's another side to this story. While these positive trends are definitely worth celebrating, it's important to remember that this isn't a universal wave of democratic renewal. We're seeing a very different pattern playing out in some parts of the world.
Oh, no. Don't tell me.
Yeah, unfortunately. It's not all sunshine and roses.
Oh, no. Don't tell me.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and roses.
Figures.
While some countries are seeing, real democratic progress, others seem stuck in a very different pattern.
Ah, I think I see where you're going with this.
Old school dictators. They're alive and well, and they are not playing by the rules.
You're right. It's like saying 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah.
What are some of the not-so-great trends we're seeing?
Well, we're seeing a number of countries where elections are being delayed, rigged, or just straight up ignored.
Okay, yeah, that's not great. Any particular examples come to mind?
Burkina Faso and Mali, for example, have both seen military coups in recent years, and they've basically pushed back any plans for a return to civilian rule.
Oh, right, I'd almost forgotten about those. That's really worrying.
It's a worrying trend in parts of Africa for sure.
And then there's
Yeah.
Russia. Not exactly a surprise, but still.
Yeah.
Depressing.
Putin just sailed to another term in office, but it was anything but a fair fight.
Opposition candidates silenced. Independent media muzzled.
The whole 9 yards. Those election results were about as believable as, I don't know, a unicorn sighting.
Oh, ouch. Sadly, not surprising, though. I think the article mentioned some other countries with similar situations.
Exactly. Rwanda, Algeria, Venezuela, they're all grappling with authoritarian leaders clinging to power through any means necessary.
It's a good thing we highlighted those positive trends earlier, because this is, well, it's pretty bleak when you think about it.
It's a stark reminder that the fight for democracy is far from over. It's a constant struggle.
Okay, so we've got these blatant dictators on one end of the spectrum, but what about those countries that fall somewhere in between? The ones that aren't full-blown dictatorships, but aren't exactly, shining examples of democracy either.
Right.
What's happening in those places?
That's where things get really interesting. The Economist article used this term hybrid regimes to describe these countries.
Hybrid regimes. Okay, that's a new one for me.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means they often hold elections, but there's a lot of manipulation, voter suppression, limits on free speech and assembly, that sort of thing.
Right, it's like democracy with an asterisk.
Exactly. You get it.
So what does voter turnout look like in these hybrid regimes? Is it sort of a mixed bag like everything else?
That's a key point. Unlike in those consolidated democracies we were talking about earlier, voter turnout in these hybrid regimes is actually way down.
Really? So even lower than usual?
Lower than we'd expect, even given the inherent flaws in these systems. And it seems like this lack of participation, it speaks volumes.
Interesting. So it's like people are voting with their absence.
In a way, yes. It's a form of protest.
Do you have any examples of that, like where low voter turnout actually made a difference?
Bangladesh is a good case study. They held an election earlier this year, but turnout was incredibly low, like way lower than usual.
Wow. And what happened?
Well, it was widely seen as a sign that people were just deeply dissatisfied with the ruling party and the state of democracy in the country. And you know what? It ultimately contributed to the leader being forced to step down.
No way. So even in a system where your vote might not feel like it counts for much, apathy can still be a powerful force.
Precisely. It suggests that people in these systems aren't buying what's being sold. They may not have the same freedoms or protections as citizens in more established democracies, but they're making their voices heard through their absence. They're signaling their discontent and demanding something better.
Okay, so we've got the overt dictators, the silent protesters in hybrid regimes. Is there anything else lurking in the shadows of global politics? Anything that's maybe a little less obvious? Okay, so we've got dictators refusing to budge, citizens in some countries staying home as a form of protest. It feels like we've already covered a lot of ground, but I get the sense there's even more to this story.
You're right, on the money. There are a few more twists and turns in this narrative. One of the most concerning trends we're seeing is that even when leaders do leave office, seemingly following democratic processes, they're finding sneaky ways to hold on to power just behind the scenes.
Okay, that sounds like something straight out of House of Cards. Is that really happening? Give us an example.
Oh, it's definitely happening. And it's a lot more subtle and insidious than just a blatant power grab. The Economist article highlighted Indonesia and Mexico as examples. In both countries, there were elections, new leaders were elected, but there are strong suspicions that the outgoing presidents are still pulling strings from behind the curtain.
How so?
They stacked parliaments with their allies, appointed loyalists to key positions, all sorts of maneuvers to maintain their influence even after they've officially left office.
Wow. So it's like this whole other level of democratic erosion. It's more about control than visibility, I guess.
Exactly. And that makes it much harder to counter, those traditional safeguards like term limits and free and fair elections. Well, they're designed to prevent outright authoritarianism, not this kind of subtle behind-the-scenes manipulation.
So how do you fight an enemy you can't even see? It almost makes the old-school dictators seem, I don't know, almost quaint in comparison.
That's an interesting way to put it. And speaking of these new breeds of political players, there's another trend that should be on everyone's radar.
What's that?
The rise of what some are calling tech-savvy
Oh,
authoritarians.
yeah, I've heard a bit about this. It's
Yeah.
that whole social media meets politics thing, right? Actually, the article mentions someone like this. Who was it?
Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador. He's a prime example of this new breed of leader.
All right, Bukele. He's young. He's on Twitter constantly. People compare him to Elon Musk sometimes. But remind me, what's the issue? I mean, he seems pretty popular.
That's what makes him so fascinating and so concerning. He's incredibly tech-savvy, uses social media brilliantly to cultivate this image of himself as, a man of the people, someone who really understands the concerns of everyday citizens. And he does. He has a lot of genuine support. But
There's always a but.
at the same time, he's been steadily consolidating his power, eroding democratic institutions, cracking down on dissent.
So it's like authoritarianism wrapped in this trendy, tech-friendly package.
You got it. And it's a strategy that seems to be resonating, especially with younger generations who are, disillusioned with traditional politics. It's a new challenge for democracy and one that we frankly don't have easy answers to.
It's almost like the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
We keep talking about all these new challenges, but isn't there also just, basic old political dysfunction that's still causing problems, even in well-established democracies?
You're absolutely right. Even in places like Europe, which, let's be honest, we tend to think of as models of democratic stability, even there we're seeing some worrying trends.
Like what?
One of the biggest is increasing political fragmentation.
Okay, for those of us who don't speak political science, what does fragmentation actually mean? What's that all about?
Essentially, it means that political parties are becoming more and more divided, and that makes it harder to form stable governments and actually get things done.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that's a problem. Got any real-world examples of how this is playing out?
Well, look at Germany. They've been struggling to form a working coalition government for months now. France isn't much better. They're dealing with constant gridlock and protests. And the Netherlands? They actually had to bring in a technocrat, someone with no party affiliation, just to hold the government together.
Wow, it sounds like they need a good couples therapist over there in Europe. So what does all this fragmentation mean in the long run? What's the big picture?
In a nutshell, it's a recipe for instability and disillusionment. When governments can't function effectively, when they can't address the real concerns of their citizens, well, it erodes trust in democracy itself. And that creates fertile ground for populism, extremism, all sorts of other uckisms that we'd rather not see.
Okay, so let's bring it all home for our listener, the learner, who, as we know, likes to cut to the chase. We've covered a lot of territory here, from those hopeful signs to some pretty daunting challenges. What's the big takeaway? What have we learned?
I think the big takeaway is that it's a complicated picture. Democracy is facing this complex web of threats, old and new, and we have to be honest about both the progress and the challenges.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're at a crossroads. So where do we go from here? What should people be watching for as we head into, the rest of this election year and beyond?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? As engaged citizens, I think we all need to be asking ourselves, if these trends continue, the rise of those tech-savvy authoritarians, the erosion of democratic norms, these deepening political divides, what kind of world are we creating? And what can we do, both individually and collectively, to shape a different future? A future where democracy isn't just surviving, but actually thriving.
That's a powerful thought to end on. I don't know about you, learner, but my to-do list just got a little longer.
Yeah.
Time to get informed and get engaged. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating look below the surface.